Well, so far this month in the unit on the giving of the law, we took a look at Exodus and we took a look at how God prepared Moses and the people to receive his laws. Then we jumped over to Deuteronomy and we heard Moses restate the Ten Commandments to that next generation as they prepared to enter into the promised land. Well, today we're going to take a look at Leviticus, and we're going to be taking a look at chapter 19, which often is referred to as the Holiness Code. And in chapter 19, it begins by saying, the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, speak to all the congregation. You see, it wasn't just to the Levites, to the priest, as the preceding chapters may appear. God wanted everybody to hear this. He said, speak to all the congregation of the people of Israel and say to them, and here's the key, you shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy. So today we're going to take a look at what does it mean to be holy. You know, we can often confuse being holy with being a particular place or a destination, something that we attain or strive for, when really holiness has a lot to do with how we act and how we think. Our writers of the lesson really want us to consider that when we are holy, it is when we think about things like God thinks about them, see things as God sees them, and care about what God cares about. Being holy is when we most resemble God in our day-to-day lives, both in our actions, our cares, and our attitudes. So let's take a look at some specific things that we find in Leviticus 19 related to being holy. He starts out in verses 3 and 4 by saying, you shall each revere your mother and father, you shall keep my Sabbaths, do not turn to idols or make cast images for yourselves. Well, this appears to be restating 4 of the 10 commandments that we studied last week. But I think it's a reminder that our ability to resemble God starts with our relationship with him. It's that vertical relationship we have with God. It's impossible for us to act, do, and think differently if we don't have that relationship with God. And so it's a reminder to us that it always begins with the relationship with God. We're going to take a look at verses 9 through 18 and look at 5 very specific areas that God wanted for his people then and now to adhere to: actions, attitudes, ways of thinking, behaviors that would help us become holy, to be like God. So starting with verses 9 and 10, we have some specific regulations towards our finances. In verse 9 it says, when you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not reap to the very edges of your field, or gather the gleanings of your harvest. You shall not strip your vineyard bare, or gather the fallen grapes of your vineyard. You shall leave them for the poor and the alien. Here we have some very specific ideas related to our finances. You know, the people in that day were called, the landowners were called not to be greedy in their business dealings, but to recognize that all of the gifts that they received, all of the bounty of their harvest really came to them as a result of God. And so in recognition of that, they were to be generous and that they were to give back some of what they were blessed with. And so when we think about our finances today, the same thing could be said is true. Being holy with our finances is being willing to be generous, to only use what we need, and to give out of our abundance to help those less fortunate than ourselves. Next, we have verses 11 through 13. You shall not steal. You shall not deal falsely, and you shall not lie to one another. This reminds us of some of the 10 commandments. You shall not swear falsely by my name, profaning the name of your God. I am the Lord. You shall not defraud your neighbor. You shall not steal, and you shall not keep for yourself the wages of a laborer until morning. Here we have some regulations that are designed to help us live honestly. And so here are some things that we are to do and to not to do, to be able to live lives that are honest, lives that are transparent. You see, we are best able to serve God when we live a life of transparency. When there are the dark corners of our life where we hope others don't figure out about us, we're never able to really be all that God would want us to. We're not able to care about people as God would want us to. We're not able to see things as God would have us see. So living a life that is upright, righteous, and honest, that's one of the ways that we become holy. Verse 14 says, "You shall not revile the deaf or put a stumbling block before the blind. You shall fear your God. I am the Lord." You notice that behind each of these, there's a punctuation that says, "Because I am God," or "I am the Lord." And it's a reminder that these are commands that we're to follow because we're trying to be like God. And that is the whole essence of being holy. And here what we see is compassion. We see an example of people who are less fortunate. In verse 14, it talks about the deaf and the blind, people who are less fortunate than we are. We're to have compassion. That's part of living our life in a holy manner, is to see things as God sees them and to care about things that God would care about, thinking about those less fortunate and being a help to them, not a harm. In verses 15 through 16, the topic is the administration of justice. "You shall not render an unjust judgment. You shall not be partial to the poor or defer to the great. With justice you shall judge your neighbor. You shall not go round as a slanderer among your people, and you shall not profit by the blood of your neighbor." So here we have the administration of justice. Not all of us are called necessarily uh, to administer justice in a professional way. We're not all judges in a courtroom, but in our own way, we all do judge people. And, we're called not to judge people, but if we are to judge, we should always judge people justly, thinking of people in the best way possible and being careful not to allow our biases to cause us to judge people unfairly. And finally, in verses 17 and 18, we have some regulations about living in community. "You shall not hate in your heart any one of your kin." That's talking about family and how we're to live with our family. "You shall reprove your neighbor, or you shall reprove your neighbor, or you will incur guilt yourself." An indication that we need to care enough about our neighbors to basically help correct them when they go astray. That's a difficult one for us to understand and even more difficult to implement. But that's what we do. That's what God does. He cares about people enough to correct them to prevent even greater harm. "You shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge against any of your people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself." Kind of takes us back to the reminder of what Jesus said about the two greatest commandments: love God and love your neighbor as yourself. So these two verses really refer to how we're to live in community among other people. You know, we don't have a choice but to live in community. That's the way the world works. And how we deal with others and how we relate to them has everything to do with being holy. So our takeaway from this week on being holy is it's not a destination, but rather it's a journey. And it's a journey that we start early in life and we continue through all of our life. It's the journey of continuing to strive to know and do God's will. It's the journey of holiness. Holiness being when we can align ourselves with God, His vision of the world, what He cares about, what He does. So this week, as we think about the idea of holiness, let's not consider that as something that can't be attained, but rather see it as something that we're to attain on a daily basis. And remember, we have a helper, the Holy Spirit, who has been given to us to be that still small voice in our heart that urges us towards holiness. Well, I hope you'll be back next week as we complete our study this month with our fourth and final lesson. Until then, have a great week. God bless you.